Good morning, everybody. I'm Marcie Roth, and I'm the director of FEMA's Office of Disability Integration and Coordination. And I'd like to thank Brook and Pam and the active members of the Venture Think Tank for inviting me to join you all today. And I do want to give a shout out to Jim Fleming, who's our Region 2 Disability Integration Specialist, who's in the back of the room. And I know we have some other FEMA colleagues who are planning on being here today. And as well, Carolyn Russo, who was one of our teammates for the period after Hurricane Sandy, where we had a number of local folks actively involved. And Carolyn is no longer with us, but once a FEMA member, always a FEMA member. So I'm going to spend some time today talking to you about what FEMA does and how we do it. I think there are perhaps some opportunities for people to have clarity about where FEMA fits in to this whole very important discussion. FEMA's mission is to support our citizens and first responders to ensure that as a nation we work together to build, sustain, and improve our capacity to prepare for, protect against, respond to, recover from, and mitigate all hazards. You'll notice that mission is not to come and rescue people in disasters. It's to support our citizens and our first responders to work together. And we'll talk more about what that means in the context of this discussion today. So when does FEMA respond? When we hear a disaster, we drop everything and come running? Is that how it works? No. We must be requested by the governor of a state after a federal emergency or disaster declaration. And then there's an assessment between the state and the federal government to determine whether or not there's been a need that exceeds the state's capacity. And then there has to be presidential approval of that declaration to allow FEMA to assist. So, I do see Kathleen Madden back there. Kathleen has been very active here on Long Island and is at our Sandy Recovery Office. I didn't see Kathleen before. So, our ability to respond is always in support of the state. Our ability to respond may not be until after an event if there was no notice of that event. For example, last week in Napa, California, there was no way to anticipate that there would be an earthquake. FEMA did position very quickly after the earthquake should the state require our assistance. They didn't ask for FEMA assistance, although now in the last 24 hours or so, there has been a request from the state that will be considered based on the impacts of the damage and not so much on any sort of immediate response requirements. So FEMA's roles and responsibilities are in the areas of disaster response and recovery, reducing risk through mitigation, trying to help learn what it is that could prevent the next incident. And we're very involved in preparedness training and exercises. And our involvement occurs throughout the year, but this is National Preparedness Month, so we are especially active and hope that you are as well in the National Preparedness Month. Others of our roles and responsibilities include training firefighters and first responders. One of the things that we're doing right now, and I'll talk about a number of things, but one of the things we're doing right now is developing some tools for first responders so that they have information that they need for decontamination. So if an individual who uses assistive devices, whether it's mobility devices or whether it's communication devices or medical devices or other assistive tools, that first responders are being trained in how to decontaminate, including those individuals and their equipment. We also oversee the National Flood Insurance Program and other preparedness initiatives for the nation. Again, National Preparedness Month and America's Prepare-a-thon are both very much underway. So you may be curious about whether FEMA responds only to certain kinds of disasters. In fact, we take an all hazards approach, and regardless of what that event was, regardless of whether there was notice in advance, regardless of what the immediate impact is, all hazards are considered potentially in need of the assistance of the federal government to the state. So during a disaster, we provide disaster aid to individuals, to their communities, and most particularly to their states. We promote risk reduction from future disasters through mitigation efforts, and may defray state and local costs under certain circumstances. And we don't have time today to get into all of those, but I just want to give you some background about what FEMA's role is and where we fit into the picture. We collaborate with state and local governments to meet the needs in joint field offices that are set up after disasters. We coordinate relief efforts with other federal agencies and voluntary and community organizations, and we keep the public informed of disaster activities. This includes two kinds of assistance. One is called public assistance, and for those of us with a human services background, I don't want to confuse you. It's not that kind of public assistance. When we talk about public assistance in the FEMA context, in the emergency management context, we're talking about repair and replacement of infrastructure and public facilities. And then the other kind of assistance that FEMA provides is individual assistance, which can include housing assistance, low-interest loans from the Small Business Administration, other needs assistance, which could include crisis counseling, disaster unemployment assistance, legal aid, and can also include medical costs, medical equipment replacement, and assistance for the kinds of losses that people with disabilities are going to experience in a disaster. Before I go on to that, does anybody know what the maximum amount of federal funding that is available by law to disaster survivors? Anybody want to venture a guess? $32,400. That's what FEMA is allowed to give, and not just individuals, but households. $32,400. So, any of you live in a $32,400 house? FEMA's disaster recovery funding is not intended to rebuild homes. It's not intended to replace all losses. We're bound by what federal law allows of us. During Hurricane Sandy, that amount was $31,900. The Consumer Price Index sets that number, and so we've gone from $31,900 to $32,400. Administrator Fugate is a staunch disability rights advocate, staunch civil rights advocate, and when he first came on board at FEMA, he said, "It is time that children, people with disabilities, or any other segment of our communities who have traditionally been underserved to be more fully and consistently integrated into preparedness and planning efforts at every level of government. And he said, my experience tells me if we wait and plan for people with disabilities after we write the basic plan, we fail. So that was the backdrop for the creation of the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination. Our role is not to handle disability issues or to, in some way, be responsible for taking care of things for everybody else. Rather, our role is to provide support, training, tools, technical assistance. The role that Jim and Kathleen play is to support the rest of our FEMA colleagues, the rest of the federal government colleagues, public and private community partners to integrate disability issues into everything that everybody else is doing. So when we think most specifically about the requirements that people have who use ventilators, our role is to provide policy guidance and recommendations and to assist others who are making primary decisions about the kinds of things that could have an impact on the preparedness, response, and recovery of an individual who uses a ventilator and the community that they live in. Our focus, as is the case by law, is on physical accessibility, program accessibility, and effective communication accessibility. We are responsible for supporting and guiding the kind of physical program and effective communication accessibility that ensures equal access to emergency services for all disaster survivors. So we advise our administrator, the regional administrators, senior leadership. During deployment, we advise the federal coordinating officer who is responsible for that particular disaster, and the Joint Field Office, leadership, and command and general staff. And if I could sum up what it is that we do, our motto is baking it in, not layering it on. We don't want to be the icing on the cake. We don't want to be the afterthought or the addendum or somebody else's problem. We want to be baked into what everybody else is doing. We have a cadre of disability integration advisors. We're 70 people strong now. We have 30 full-time disability integration advisors and 40 reservists. Among those, 20 are American Sign Language interpreters. We also hire disaster-specific disability integration advisors from local communities because we know that you all know your communities, you know your resources, you know the challenges and the opportunities in your local communities far better than beds coming in from some other part of the country. We also engage our federal partners when need be, and during Hurricane Sandy, for example, we had folks from the Department of Transportation, from the FCC, and from Department of Homeland Security, Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, as part of our Disability Integration Advisor team. There are a number of federal laws that prohibit discrimination in emergency programs on the basis of disability, and many of you are probably familiar with most of these laws, including the Rehabilitation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Stafford Act, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, Fair Housing Act amendments, Architectural Barriers Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Telecommunications Act, 21st Century Communications and Data Accessibility Act. And there are others as well. But each of these speaks to the requirement to provide equal access, and that includes providing equal access to emergency programs. So, of most significance to the federal government, the Rehabilitation Act has some particular requirements that I want to bring to your attention, and that would be that any recipient or subrecipient of federal funds is required to make their programs accessible to individuals with disabilities. Its protections apply to all programs and businesses that receive any federal funds. This applies to all elements of physical, architectural, programmatic, and communication accessibility in all services and activities that are conducted by or funded by FEMA. So as we talk about where your power is in all of this, I want to point out to you that there is a legal obligation for the federal government to comply with the Rehabilitation Act in everything that we spend money on. Anybody have any questions before I move on? I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of the rest of the slides. Okay. These laws apply across the board, from preparation to exercises to notification, evacuation, transportation, sheltering, first aid and medical services, temporary lodging and housing, transition, cleanup, recovery, mitigation, etc. So there is no aspect of emergency management that is not impacted by the requirements of the Rehab Act and these other laws. And when we talk about who we're serving, we have moved away from referring to people as having special needs, because that's really the antithesis of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make this a whole community responsibility, because it is everybody's responsibility to personally prepare, to assist your family to prepare, your neighbors, and that means that it's not just about legal requirements. So there are people who have those legal protections. There are people for whom equal access to emergency programs is an imperative. But there are many other people who have similar access and functional needs who also benefit from the very same things. A very easy example would be the benefits that many people have as a result of curb cuts. Curb cuts are required by law. People with disabilities require curb cuts if they use mobility devices, and lots of other people benefit from the same curb cuts. People with luggage, strollers, grocery carts, skateboarders, bicyclers, etc., etc. So when we talk about access and functional needs, we're talking about a whole host of individuals who may not have those legal protections, but still have all of the same access requirements. And when those access requirements are not universally baked in, then they are also going to have some functional requirements. And in the circumstances of a disaster, whether you've had your disability for 20 years or 2 minutes, it really doesn't matter, because you're still going to need that equal access in order to be able to survive the disaster. I talked a little bit a moment ago about language. So we have moved away from using the term special needs. We don't refer to people as special populations. We have moved away from thinking about individuals as being vulnerable or at risk. We're all vulnerable, we're all at risk. And it's very important that we think about disproportionate impact. And I'm particularly concerned about the disproportionate impact of people who require access to electricity. I'm particularly concerned about the disproportionate impact of people who require information in alternate formats, because if they don't receive that information, they can't take action. And when people can't take action, then others are going to have to assist them if they're going to save their lives. And we have a shortage of first responders in this country. We have a shortage of people who are responsible for emergency response. And we have no shortage of 309 million people who, each of us, have the information that we need to take action for ourselves, for our family, for our neighbors, that we kill, weather many different kinds of disasters very well together. So it's about decreasing the impact, and it's not about setting some folks aside as being vulnerable or at risk. This is not about special populations. This is about people, individuals. Everybody has individual needs, diagnoses, and Brook talked about this very well earlier. Having a diagnosis does not tell you much about what a person needs. When we address things from a functional perspective, when we address things from an access perspective, we need to be doing that in terms of what individuals need and not populations. And most important of everything that we do, we're not planning for somebody else, we're planning with. And if planning with does not include having the people who are going to be most disproportionately impacted at the table, then we need to think long and hard about what it is we're doing, because we are not engaging the whole community. The experts on so much of this are folks who live it on a daily basis. And planning for people rather than with them is a missed opportunity to engage the experts and to drive real solutions rather than operating from assumptions. We have a saying in the disability community, many of you are well aware, nothing about us without us. And we mean that. If we're planning, if we're talking about any of these issues, disability advocates, disability community leaders need to be at the table. We need to have a place at the table. That needs to be an accessible table. That means that it needs to be physically accessible, it needs to be programmatically accessible, and it means that communication needs to be accessible for people to bona fidely participate. We have typically thought of people with disabilities as liabilities in emergencies and disasters, and we need to give people the tools that they need to become assets, whether that's personal preparedness, family preparedness, neighborhood preparedness, community, or for those of us who have really gone off the edge and gotten involved in national preparedness. When people have the information, the tools, the resources that they need, we can be assets in very significant ways. And so much about this is partnership. And Brooke and Pam have both talked about those partnerships. Many of you in this room are great examples of those partnerships. And it is critical that we look at who needs to be at those tables. If there are going to be medication issues after a disaster, we need to have the local pharmacy, which is the association at the table. If there are going to be housing issues after a disaster, because by the way, we probably haven't figured out that accessible housing thing before the disaster, right? And that doesn't get a whole lot better after the disaster. So we need to have the housing folks at the planning table so that when they're talking about housing, they're including emergency housing. We need to have the transportation folks at the table so that when they're talking about accessible transportation, they're talking about evacuation as well. Healthcare providers, when they're talking about access to healthcare, that they're talking about access to healthcare in emergencies and disasters. Power company was really pleased to see that the local power company is very much a partner in all of this. These are critical relationships, and not the kind of relationships we should start making during the disaster, but long before the disaster. We have had many lessons that we have learned, and I keep looking around the room for the clock, and I don't see any clocks. Could somebody please give me a time check? How are we doing now? 12:03, and 10 minutes, super. Very good, thank you. There have been a lot of lessons taught. I'm reluctant to refer to them as lessons learned because I'm not convinced that we've learned them. I think we may have admired the problems. I don't know that we have necessarily done anything to solve them. But among those lessons is, of course, that we're all vulnerable. And many people are disproportionately impacted. These needs are the needs of resilient communities. The more that we invest in universal accessibility, the more we're going to have everyone have an equal opportunity before, during, and after a disaster to benefit from those programs. And planning is much more successful when everyone has a place at that table. Some of the promising practices that we're seeing include universal accessibility. And anybody know how much money came into the state of New York after Hurricane Sandy in federal funds? You want to venture a guess? $30 billion. How many of those $30 billion does the Rehab Act apply to? That'd be all of them, right? Every federal dollar. And of the money that comes in from the federal government during a disaster, 5% must be used in disaster mitigation. Disaster mitigation is a fabulous opportunity, as is disaster recovery, to invest in universal accessibility. These are the only time that some communities will have huge rebuilding opportunities. So whether it's rebuilding schools, or rebuilding hospitals, or rebuilding housing, or community centers, or roads, or public thoroughfares, or transportation, in that disaster recovery and in the mitigation efforts, universal accessibility baked right into what everybody's doing, not just complying with what the law requires, but really working together towards universal accessibility makes a community more resilient for the next 100 years. So when we have people with disabilities at the table, when it's a real role, not a tokenized role, and when people serve in leadership roles, not just the disability representative, but as leaders across emergency management, we are able to provide the kind of input that assists in that universal accessibility. So we at FEMA provide a variety of guidance tools, resources. We do quite a bit of training across the country. We have an online training course that's free. You might be interested. And it's called Including People with Disabilities and Others with Access and Functional Needs in Disaster Operations. We also have an instructor-led course that we bring to states. We are very involved in making sure that disaster exercises are not token opportunities to have an inject for one or another disability scenario, but that rather exercises are an opportunity to take a look at how we bake in the physical program and effective communication and access issues throughout the practice that communities go through in their exercises. And the whole community needs to be involved in this. There need to be people with a variety of disabilities. We should never be using actors to play people with disabilities. And we should pose real-life challenges. People with disabilities should not be simply playing dead or playing gravely injured, but really posing as real-life challenges. In preparedness, I've put up one of my favorite photos here. This is a picture of a zombie attack survival kit. And we tell people when we talk about all hazards that you should be prepared for the thing that is least likely to happen. I can assure you I don't think that we need to be preparing for zombies, but my point is that we need to prepare for the thing that's least likely to happen. And I could spend a whole lot of time talking about some of the least likely to happen things that have happened over the last couple of years. You all have lived through some of them. So we need to be very mindful that we need to plan for the next disaster and not for the last disaster. And we just don't know what that next disaster is going to be. I want to take a moment and talk about space weather. Everybody put on your tinfoil hat. Anybody follow space weather? Maybe one or ish, 2 or 3 people. A couple of the FEMA folks, fortunately. Anybody heard in the news last couple of days that we have a big solar storm underway, and tomorrow there's going to be storm impacts? Anybody notice that? Now that I've said it, you will notice that. What is space weather? Well, there are 3 kinds of space weather when they impact Earth's magnetosphere. Radio blackouts, which are solar flares, radiation storms, and geomagnetic storms. We've had some extreme space weather events in the past, none since 1921. They're scaled just like hurricanes. They're scaled just like tornadoes. And there are, again, 3 kinds: radio blackouts, solar radiation, and geomagnetic. The G scale are the ones that we're most concerned about. They range from a G1 to a G5. And the geomagnetic can actually affect the power grid. Satellites can be adversely affected. They can do damage to the power grid. So we are particularly mindful at this time that with the storm underway, that we may see some impacts. We don't anticipate that this is a G5 storm. The G5 could have some very detrimental impacts. I think I read this morning this is like a G3, but it's still a pretty big deal. The impact of space weather. If the electrical power remains available, even the worst space weather event would be inconvenient and not catastrophic. FEMA's role is to obtain and disseminate information on the status of the event, advise the President, and activate and coordinate federal assets and resources to support state, local, and tribal response and recovery efforts. So our role in all of this is to raise issues about the impact on people with disabilities. So we are particularly concerned about people who are dependent on life-sustaining power, people who have access and functional needs, communication networks that could be affected, and then those cascading impacts. So I can assure you that those discussions are underway. I can also assure you, if you're not having those discussions at the local level, that those are discussions you all need to be having, and you need to be having them now. So the power grid is owned by the private sector. FEMA and our partners across federal, state, local, and tribal are working on plans to address, again, in support of states. We only assist when the state requests our assistance. So I would encourage you to pay more attention to solar weather, and I would encourage you to get others around you to pay more attention. Your personal preparedness, there are a number of things that we encourage you to do. And if you require power, if it's an option to invest in a generator, you also need to address adequate fuel. Consider alternative sources of power. I often, at this point, refer to Brook's solar-powered system in her backyard. I even have a great picture of Brook with her solar panels. If you need to evacuate, before evacuation, long before evacuation, I would encourage you to be looking at where those resources for alternate power can be found, so that you don't need to go to the hospital. I think we all agree that the hospital is the last place that somebody who's living in the community, who uses a ventilator, who maintains their health, who is not acutely ill needs to not go to hospitals simply because there's no other power resource. I see lots of people nodding in agreement. We work across alerts and warnings to make sure that folks have the information that they need so that those alerts and warnings are made available in local communities. We work on evacuation issues, both evacuation from buildings, within buildings, and away from buildings. We work on mass care issues. The general population shelters are equipped to meet the needs of the folks who come, including access to power for folks who come to shelter in general population shelters. We make sure that there are a variety of tools and resources made available to the state. Those include guidance and specific things like accessible cots, durable medical equipment that the state can use. We have personal assistance services contracts that we can bring in as many as 2,500 personal assistance service providers to shelters and temporary housing. Again, the state must request that service. After Hurricane Sandy, New York requested that service. We provided 200 personal assistance service providers. New Jersey, as another example, chose not to utilize that contract. The folks here in New York who utilized it found it was very successful. Those personal assistance services contracts cover all of the very same kinds of things that people use personal assistance services for on a daily basis. Our caches of medical equipment are filled with all sorts of equipment that makes it possible for people to, away from their home, away from their most accessible environments, to be able to maintain some accessibility. Our disaster recovery centers have a variety of equipment and communication access devices so that people can apply for services from FEMA and other service providers. In our housing, we provide uniform federal accessibility standard units. We have the ability to provide those units on demand. We have an unlimited ability to provide those as requested. I'm now putting up a picture. This is one of my favorite pictures of a bad idea for providing accessibility in housing. It's really important that we provide accessible housing to folks, but this is a picture of a house that has a ramp that has, I don't know, 15 or 20 turns in order to stay in compliance with the 1-to-1 rise requirement. Not probably the best way to go. And in closing, I want to point out that in disaster recovery, some of the issues around requirements for elevating homes are placing a significant additional challenge on the lives of people who need accessible housing. And it's not just their own homes, but many people who were very welcome in the neighborhood, very welcome in the community, as their neighbors are raising their homes. Individuals may not be able to continue to visit in the way that they once did. And if you are rebuilding your home and you elevate and you have family members or friends, even if they may not use mobility devices today, at any point you or they might. And so that elevation issue is not just today's issue, it's tomorrow's issue as well. So one last point, FEMA provides many billions of dollars every year in federal grants. Most of those are to states. States then prioritize what they're going to spend that money on, and FEMA provides guidance to tell states very specifically that we encourage grantees to address how their investments will provide equal access and increased effectiveness of emergency preparedness planning and response, and to increase the involvement of disability inclusion experts as partners across all aspects of emergency management. We can't tell the states how to spend their money, but we can certainly provide guidance in what is allowable. And so we would encourage you to become knowledgeable about all of that so that you can, as our partners, help your states to optimize these resources. And when we do this well, this is not just about making things better for people with disabilities. This is about making communities stronger and more resilient. This is a benefit for everyone. And so we need your voices. We need your knowledge, your guidance every step of the way. And thank you all for the opportunity to spend time with you. And I think we're going to have time for a few questions. Or maybe not. Afterwards. Super. But thank you very much, everybody. I just put up a slide so where you can find me.
Yeah, that's all I can get. Do you have the slides? Anyway, can you put them up on here?
He didn't give me a slide. Do you want to put on that you can start the art slide? Is there a way to, I think it's the second session. Yeah. Is there a way to start the, how do we start the art slideshow?
Yeah, everything's just fine right here. What do you have it?
Do we need to go into YouTube?
Yeah.
You can just sign onto YouTube.
You can
Okay, that's fine.
Perfect. My name is Alejandro Espina. My partner is Nick Dupree. Nick couldn't be here today and he couldn't join remotely for a number of technical and personal reasons, which I know a lot of folks with disabilities, and particularly ventilator users, can identify with. Things change on a dime. So you've got me instead, which I think is fine. Nick Dupree grew up in a family of artists in Mobile, Alabama. He also grew up in a family affected by a mysterious neuromuscular condition that loosely falls under the muscular dystrophy umbrella, but really has never been identified. Nick's brother is also ventilator dependent, and Nick's brother Jamie was one of the first infants in the early 80s to live at home with a tracheostomy and a ventilator. So in that way, the family broke ground. Nick is also known for what was called Nick's Crusade, where he fought a battle where Alabama Medicaid policy was changed to provide 24-hour care for ventilator users in their communities where that otherwise doesn't exist. If you're familiar with how Medicaid works, it varies widely from state to state as to what they provide in terms of long-term care, the kinds of care that they provide for people with different kinds of disabilities. And although Nick was successful in his campaign in Alabama and a waiver was created that got about 24 ventilator-dependent people on it and allowed them to continue receiving care in their homes instead of having to go to nursing homes, eventually he figured out that he couldn't stay in Mobile, Alabama and get the kind of care that he needed. So he came to New York. And that began another version of a crusade. But in the meantime, Nick has always been an artist. He has a progressive neuromuscular disability, which means he eventually became ventilator dependent. But before that was the case, he was drawing cartoons and comics. At the age of 9, he was very prolific. He could use his hands. Over time, because it's a neuromuscular disability, he stopped being able to use his hands. So he transitioned to becoming a digital artist. And the art that you see here was all digitally created. That's his superhero super dude that he created as a child. So eventually he lost the ability to breathe on his own, and he had to get a tracheostomy, and he became fully ventilator dependent about 20 years ago. And he sort of lost his artistic focus for a while because he didn't know if the way he had to make art now was fulfilling to him. And then later, when he moved to New York 6 years ago, he was basically busy fighting for his life and fighting to get the care that he needed to be a vent-dependent person living in New York. And eventually, once he got settled and could live in the community with enough support, he said, hey, I'm going to go back to my art, and I'm going to explore what it means to be someone who needs mechanical ventilation, can't use their hands anymore, is ventilator dependent, is straight, but is still an artist. So what you're seeing in this slideshow is sort of the evolution of Nick's art. He's been, I can't speak to it as well as he can, but he's been creating a lot of different self-portraits that address himself and his vent. You know, he wants all that front and center because it's a big identifier for him. It's something he lives with every day. We also lived through Hurricane Sandy as a ventilator-dependent family. We fought to stay in place because, as we know, lots of folks who are vent-dependent can't just get up and go, no matter how accessible the local shelter is. So that's a theme that he's also been visiting in his art. And I wish that, you know, I had giant prints of all of it because I think it's all fantastic, and I wish that he was here to have a deeper conversation about what it means to him. But basically, all this art was digitally created. He uses a trackball mouse and a variety of digital art programs, and he's really focusing on these portraits, and he joined Venture as a way to contribute to the ventilator-dependent community. And because while we were in the middle of Hurricane Sandy, and he has experience with all of the hurricanes across the Gulf Coast growing up in Alabama, he knows how underrepresented folks who need ventilator assistance are, and he just wants to find a way to show people that vent users exist, that they lead full, rich lives, even if they have to be at home and in bed and not here with us. You know, communication is a huge thing for a lot of vent-dependent people. All, you know, their primary mode of communication might be an assistive communication device, the internet, and that is how Nick is making his connections to the world today. So the fact that we're focusing on technology and improving access to communication and access to emergency management and access to all the things that people need and deserve to participate in their lives is what brought Nick and his art here today. So I don't have as much to say as I would have liked about the art itself, but I think if our technical difficulties resolve themselves, we might have a chance to get Nick back, yeah? Maybe? So I think I'm good on time, but if there are any questions or anything about the art that I might be able to answer, I'm happy to do that.
Or Marcie or Homeland. I'm going to read voice for you. Question, Marcie, has to do with why states request different services. For example, your example was the personal care providers. Why would one state request it and another state not, given a particular hurricane both statewide? You might have to repost.
So your question is, why would one state choose to use those personal assistance services contracts and another state not?
Or any
Right, right. There's a cost share involved for the state. And typically after a disaster, the federal government is going to pay 75% and the state's going to pay 25%. Some states may decide that they don't need that resource, that they have not exceeded their capacity to meet those needs. Other states may decide that they need some assistance. Some might decide that it's a cost that they're willing to pay for, and some states might decide that that's not something that they're willing to pay for.
Scenario where the state might not have the budget, but has the need. But, so in other words, they don't have the budget to do the cost share.
So the question is, could I imagine a situation where the state doesn't have the budget but does have the need? I imagine that on a daily basis because none of the states have a budget for providing personal assistance services in disasters. I shouldn't say none of the states. There are some states that are doing some great proactive work around how they're going to address those needs in state, and doing some really good work around what it is that what do they anticipate would be the need, what do they anticipate would be their capacity, and then what would be the delta that they might then need the federal government to assist with. But I would venture to guess that very few states would say that they have a budget to do it. But I would guess that they wouldn't say that they have a budget to do any of the other disaster-related, very unexpected, very surprising expenditures. Even, states will have a certain budget established for how many days of snow removal they can handle, or how much sand, right? And if they exceed that, it's not like they're not going to go out and remove the snow or lay the sand. So I think for our purposes, our role collectively as partners in all of this is to help our states to have a better understanding of what is one of those things that you're going to do, whether you have a budget for it or not. And so let's work in advance to plan as effectively as we can so that you have an understanding of what your capacity is and that you can optimize that. In this area, you have, we're standing on the grounds of a facility that has a variety of medical-related programs, training programs. Is this university engaged with this community around emergency preparedness and the kinds of supports and services that might be needed? I don't know what the answer is, but if it isn't, this is a great opportunity. And I think for students, it's a fabulous learning experience. For people with disabilities who require personal assistance services, many of my friends and colleagues would rather have no one who has no experience anyway, so they can train them up themselves. So students are sometimes just ideal for that because they haven't been ruined by the process.
I'd like a comment and a question. One, I guess my comment, I am a friend of Nick's, so I also wanted to share that, like, in his bio, he's a writer and being an artist, and so I like, there's another form of representation that he talks about, with events and co-authors, really. And then, so that's one. A question I have is, in emergency preparedness, more of a is there, is one goal a database where people live so that things can be much more quickly implemented, or does that feel, for lack of a better word, like more or less to account, does that feel like personal privacy, or is that like is that a goal that we'll have to say? This is we may have to get.
Well, I'm sure that Marcie can be more intelligently about how protocols are implemented across the beaches to know what is implemented here. I think it's probably reflected on how the question is there like a part of the data management capability for emergency responders of how rapid or natural what is done here so what is done here is that the local power provider has what's called a prepare. This is voluntary record of people who have who are here as their dependents or who have that would worthy of the emergency power provider, the emergency responders being aware of power outages of the past there. And what is interesting is that just really and kind of people management of business pushing away from on the list, and getting preventive power outages doesn't really guarantee restoration of service is kind of just referred by eviction power provider. The potential of the storm or potential of disaster. And as a result of that, there's not too much in the way of, at least not here, too much in the way of governmental collaboration from state to counties, our department of Congress. That's one issue that I do kind of dig the knowledge for seamless from what's going on at the state level, at the level that people need to get them. If people, the emergency responders know where services are, and that really hasn't been done in any kind of proactive way, at least as far as I know, as far as the data that we have, we need to keep our
revoiced our comment that names of writers are not. How to write would we leave that to his writings on?
So, I would love to give you examples of where registries have been successful. I think in theory, there is some value to the notion that people would identify what their needs are and somebody else would then meet those needs. In practice, I don't see that working for a whole host of reasons. First of all, if those of you who are in this room were registered and there was a disaster right now, you wouldn't be where you registered. And so we'd be sending a lot of first responders out to assist you. You wouldn't be there. And then those first responders wouldn't be available to assist you where you are. So the registry operates from the premise that people will always be at home, which is, you know, sort of reinforcing a kind of an old school belief about the lives of people with disabilities. Additionally, many people will register and then they'll say, told the government what I need. I don't need to do anything else. I don't need to personally prepare because the government's going to come and get me. And that is not accurate. Additionally, there are, in a significant event, there are way too many people and way too many competing needs. Coming to look for people doing wellness checks is not something that's going to happen right away. And if you're somebody who requires electricity for life-sustaining equipment, that would not be a great plan. Furthermore, those power company registries, I think people think I'm on the priority list, and so that means that I'm going to receive priority attention. But the power companies may have people in every neighborhood in their area that are priority customers, and they aren't going to be able to go to all of those communities as a priority. And they're not going to drive, and I live in Washington, D.C., so I'm not going to make any jokes about the transit traffic around here, but I would venture to guess that the power company probably wouldn't go leaping from one part of the county to another, that they would probably be proceeding pretty systematically, because otherwise you're going to spend your day on the road rather than providing that service. Excuse me. One of the things that I am seeing that I think is tremendously promising is using those already existing registries, those already existing pieces of information about people. So for those individuals who use paratransit, that information is pretty good information, and probably especially good because, for instance, if you took paratransit to get here, then the paratransit company has a record that you're not at your house, you're here. The folks who deliver durable medical equipment, the folks who deliver oxygen, they have a lot of information. The Meals on Wheels folks have a lot of information. That information is very current for a lot of people. So we've been really working to uncover what the barriers are to utilizing those existing information sources, rather than having people voluntarily, and then, as you had said earlier, you know, some folks are concerned about surveillance issues, some folks are concerned about privacy issues. In some states, the laws don't protect that personal information. If somebody wants to buy those lists, they can buy them. So there's, my long-winded answer is I would encourage you to look at other alternatives to registries, and there are some good ideas out there.
Saying that Northern Gas downstairs, the only, and we next hour, however, the only rule is that food stays downstairs. So we use the space on the art and small business.
Mine is close. That's us. So I look for new different.
Convention too.
Just put it on the desktop and you can move from the desktop.
Just test it.
Sure. Can I without this? So this one's a rotation.
We've got stepped out to the here.